November 13th, 2021. Two young women leave a warehouse party in East Los Angeles. Within hours, both are dying. Christy Giles, a 24-year-old aspiring model, is found dumped outside Southern California hospital, already dead. Her best friend, 26-year-old architect Hilda Marcela Cabrales-Arzola, is abandoned at Kaiser Permanente Hospital, clinging to life. The men who brought them? Masked, untraceable, gone. But here's what makes your blood run cold. The toxicology reports revealed a cocktail of death: fentanyl, cocaine, GHB, ketamine, and MDMA pumping through their veins. This wasn't an accidental overdose. This was calculated, deliberate, murder. What happened in those missing hours between the party and the hospital? Who were the men these women trusted that night? And why did they think they could simply disappear after dumping two dying women on sidewalks like garbage? The answer will expose a Hollywood predator's decade-long reign of terror, a pattern of drugging and assault that authorities now believe claimed dozens of victims. 7 women would eventually testify about similar attacks spanning from 2007 to 2020. But before we uncover the monster hiding in plain sight, I need you to do something. If this case shocks you, if it makes you question who you can trust, hit that like button. Share this story because Christy and Hilda's voices were silenced, but their story demands to be heard. Subscribe and ring that notification bell because justice in this case took over 3 years, and the details that emerge will change how you see Hollywood forever. Within 35 minutes of arriving at David Pierce's Beverly Hills apartment, Hilda was already calling for a rideshare to escape. But it was too late. The drugs were already coursing through their systems. So what exactly happened in apartment 1202? And how did a 40-year-old Hollywood producer convince 2 intelligent, cautious women to trust him with their lives? The investigation that followed would uncover digital evidence, security footage, and testimonies that painted a picture so disturbing, so methodical that even seasoned detectives were left shaken. David Pierce was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder, but the full scope of his crimes reaches far beyond one tragic night. This is the story of 2 best friends who thought they were safe, a predator who believed he was untouchable, and the digital breadcrumbs that finally brought him down. But most importantly, this is about the other women who survived to tell their stories, and the ones who might never get that chance. What you're about to hear will disturb you. It should disturb you, because somewhere tonight, another predator is counting on your silence, your assumption that it could never happen to me. Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales-Arzola deserve better than that silence. They deserve the truth. Before that horrific November night changed everything, these were 2 women building extraordinary lives in Los Angeles. 2 dreamers who believed in the promise of the city of angels. Christy Giles was 24 years old, born and raised in Alabama with the fierce determination of a natural athlete. She wasn't just another pretty face trying to make it in Hollywood. She was a competitor. Track and field shaped her early years, teaching her discipline, resilience, and the drive to push beyond limits. When she set her sights on modeling, she approached it with that same athletic intensity. But Christy wasn't chasing fame for fame's sake. She had found love in the most unexpected place, an art gallery in Los Angeles, where she met Jan Cilliers, a South African-born visual effects artist and photographer. Jan wasn't just captivated by her beauty, he fell for her free spirit, her kindness to strangers, her ability to light up any room she entered. Their marriage represented everything hopeful about starting fresh in a new city. 2 artists supporting each other's dreams. Jan would later describe her as someone who lived life to the fullest. But here's what makes this tragedy even more heartbreaking. Christy was careful. She wasn't reckless. She understood the dangers that young women face in Hollywood, especially beautiful ones trying to make connections in an industry built on power imbalances. Then there was Hilda Marcela Cabrales-Arzola. 26 years old, brilliant, accomplished, everything about her life screamed success. She had graduated summa cum laude from the prestigious Universidad de Monterrey in Mexico, one of the country's most elite institutions. Architecture wasn't just her profession, it was her passion. She specialized in interior design, transforming spaces, creating beauty from empty rooms. Since November 2019, Hilda worked as a lead project manager at Atrio Interiors, but she had bigger dreams. She was planning her move to Los Angeles permanently, ready to take on the American market. Her family and friends describe a woman who loved dancing, who took pride in dressing elegantly, who approached every challenge with meticulous planning and intelligence. Here's what's fascinating about their friendship. They were complete opposites. Christy, the bold Alabama athlete turned model, spontaneous and adventurous. Hilda, the methodical architect from Mexico, analytical and cautious. One would think such different personalities might clash, but instead, they balanced each other perfectly. Hilda was the friend who would research every restaurant before going out, who always had a backup plan. Christy was the one who would convince her cautious friend to try something new, to take that leap of faith. Together, they represented the best of young women supporting each other in a challenging city. But here's where their story takes a devastating turn. Both women understood the risks of Los Angeles nightlife. They weren't naive college girls out for their first taste of freedom. Christy had been navigating the entertainment industry for years. Hilda had the sharp instincts of someone who had built a successful career through careful decision-making. So what happened that night? What could have convinced two intelligent, cautious women to trust strangers with their safety? How did an evening that started with friendship and celebration end with one woman dead on a hospital sidewalk and another fighting for her life? The answer lies in understanding a predator's methodology. How someone like David Pierce spent over a decade perfecting the art of deception. Because this wasn't random. This wasn't a chance encounter gone wrong. This was a calculated hunt, and Christy and Hilda had unknowingly walked into a trap that had been set for years, refined through practice, and executed with the cold precision of someone who believed he would never be caught. What does the last normal day of your life look like? For Christy Giles, it started with pure joy, a walk on the beach with her beloved cat, Loki, watching the sunset over Marina del Rey. She sent Jan a video caption, "Me and the Sand Panther together forever," holding up their feline friend. The last text she would ever send her husband? "I wish you were here." Jan would later tell investigators, "I will forever wish that I was there too." But here's what haunts everyone who knew her. Christy, Hilda, and a third friend who refuses to be publicly identified, had planned what seemed like an innocent girls' night out. 3 successful women, supporting each other, celebrating life in the city they all loved. November 12th, 2021. A Friday night that began like thousands of others in Los Angeles. The evening started at Soho House in West Hollywood. If you've never been, it's the kind of exclusive members-only club where Hollywood's elite network over craft cocktails and carefully curated art. Beautiful people discussing beautiful projects. The air thick with ambition and possibility. For Christy, this wasn't unusual. She belonged in these spaces, comfortable navigating the social dynamics that intimidate most people. But here's where the story takes its first crucial turn. After 1 a.m., the trio decided to move on to an all-night dance party at an East LA warehouse. Not some random underground rave, but a legitimate event where their favorite DJ was performing. This wasn't reckless behavior. This was 3 friends following music they loved to a venue they researched. Christy was described by those who knew her as someone who knew how to live in the moment, but she wasn't careless. She understood the rules of LA nightlife. Stay together. Watch your drinks. Trust your instincts. At that warehouse party, among hundreds of other music lovers, 3 men noticed them. David Pierce, Michael Ansbach, and Brant Osborne. To everyone watching, it looked completely normal, attractive people talking, laughing, maybe sharing drinks. Social media posts from that night show smiling faces, good vibes, the kind of content that fills Instagram stories every weekend across America. But David Pierce wasn't just another partygoer looking for a good time. For over a decade, he had been perfecting a system. The 7 other sexual assault charges against him date back as far as 2007. 7 different women who would eventually find the courage to testify about similar encounters, being drugged, assaulted, discarded. What made Pierce so dangerous wasn't just his predatory behavior. It was his patience, his ability to seem trustworthy, his understanding of how to exploit social situations. He knew that successful, Intelligent women like Christy and Hilda wouldn't normally go home with strangers. So he didn't push. He built comfort. He made them feel safe. And it worked. Somehow. Despite all their caution, despite their intelligence, despite having each other for protection, David, Michael, and Brant convinced Christy and Hilda to leave the party with them. But here's the part that will make your skin crawl. We know now that this wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't three guys getting lucky with two beautiful women. The toxicology reports revealed a cocktail so specific, so calculated, that it had to be planned. Fentanyl, cocaine, GHB, ketamine, MDMA. That's not a random mix of party drugs. That's a chemical weapon designed to incapacitate. So when exactly were they drugged? Was it at the warehouse party, slipped into drinks while they were dancing? Or was it later, after they had been convinced to go somewhere private? The timeline investigators pieced together suggests the women were conscious when they left the party, which means they walked willingly into their own destruction. Christy's final text message to her friend was discovered later. She wrote that they should leave the West Hollywood apartment they were at. Think about that for a moment. Even through the haze of whatever drugs were already in her system, Christy's instincts were screaming danger. She recognized something was wrong, but by then, it was already too late. Within hours of that final text, both women would be unconscious, dying, their bodies dumped outside hospitals by masked men who thought they could simply disappear into the night. What happened in those missing hours between leaving the warehouse party and being abandoned on hospital sidewalks? What did Christy and Hilda experience in their final conscious moments? How long were they aware of what was happening to them before the drugs took hold completely? The digital trail they left behind, phone records, security footage, credit card transactions, would eventually tell a story so horrifying that even seasoned detectives struggled to process it. Because this wasn't just murder, this was the culmination of a predator's decade-long evolution, a man who had learned exactly how to hunt, how to trap, and how to dispose of evidence. David Pierce had convinced himself that he was untouchable, that his victims would never be believed, never find each other, never have the courage to speak up. He was wrong about that. But he was almost right about something even more chilling. By sunrise on November 13th, everything had changed. Two families were about to receive the worst phone calls of their lives. A husband was about to discover that his wife's body had been dumped like trash. And a predator was about to learn that some crimes are too heinous, leave too much evidence, involve victims too loved, and miss to simply disappear. But first he had to get through one more night of believing he had gotten away with murder. Saturday morning, November 13th, 2021, 5 a.m. The sun hasn't even risen over Los Angeles when the first security camera captures what would become one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in this entire case. A black Toyota Prius with no license plates pulls up to Southern California Hospital in Culver City. Two figures dressed completely in black, faces covered with bandanas, step out of the vehicle. They move with calculated precision, not the panicked urgency of people trying to save a life, but the cold efficiency of men executing a plan. One opens the passenger door. The other positions himself as a lookout. Together, they lift Christy Giles from the car and place her on the sidewalk outside the hospital's emergency entrance. 24 years old, already dead. They don't knock on the doors. They don't call for help. They don't even check if she has a pulse. They simply deposit her body like a package being delivered, climb back into their vehicle, and drive away into the pre-dawn darkness. The entire sequence takes less than 3 minutes. But here's what makes your blood run cold. This isn't the behavior of people who accidentally gave someone too much of something. This isn't panic. This isn't remorse. This is disposal. This is the methodical elimination of evidence by men who believed they had committed the perfect crime. Hospital staff discovered Christy's lifeless body at approximately 5:15 a.m. No identification, no purse, no phone, no way to know who this beautiful young woman was or what had happened to her. The Los Angeles County coroner would initially list her as Jane Doe number 27. Jane Doe 27. Think about that for a moment. In a city of 4 million people, Christy Giles became just another number, another unidentified body in a system overwhelmed by anonymous death. This is exactly what her killers were counting on, that she would remain nameless, faceless, forgotten. But they made one crucial mistake. They underestimated how deeply Christy was loved. While her body lay in the morgue unidentified, hundreds of people were already looking for her. Jan Cilliers hadn't heard from his wife since her last text message. Their friend, the third woman who had wisely left the party early, was frantically trying to reach both Christy and Hilda. Family members in Alabama were calling, texting, reaching out to anyone who might know where she was. This wasn't a woman who could disappear unnoticed. 2 hours later, 7 a.m., the same black Prius appears on security footage at Kaiser Permanente Hospital in West Los Angeles. Same two masked figures, same methodical approach. But this time, there's a difference. Their passenger is still alive. Hilda Marcela Cabrales Arzola is unconscious, barely breathing, but her heart is still beating. The men lift her from the car with the same cold efficiency they showed with Christy, place her outside the emergency entrance, and once again disappear into the morning traffic. But Hilda's survival, even in a comatose state, would prove to be David Pierce's ultimate downfall. Because unlike Christy, whose body could only tell the story of how she died, Hilda's living but damaged brain would provide investigators with crucial evidence about exactly what had been done to both women. Hospital staff rushed Hilda into emergency care, but the prognosis was devastating. The same cocktail of drugs that had killed Christy had caused massive brain damage. Doctors told her family there was virtually no chance of recovery. She was placed on life support while her loved ones faced the impossible decision that no parent should ever have to make. For 13 agonizing days, Hilda remained in that liminal space between life and death, while investigators worked around the clock to piece together what had happened. Her father, Luis Rivera, flew from Mexico to be by her side, holding vigil while police desperately searched for answers. On November 26th, 13 days after being dumped outside that hospital, Hilda was declared brain dead. Her family made the heartbreaking decision to remove life support, but not before ensuring that her organs would be donated to save other lives. Even in death, even after everything that had been done to her, Hilda's final act was one of generosity and hope. But here's what haunts everyone involved in this case. Why were these women treated like disposable objects? Why were they stripped of their identification and abandoned at hospitals like pieces of trash? What kind of monster dumps a dying woman on a sidewalk and drives away? The answer lies in understanding the psychology of someone like David Pierce. This wasn't his first time disposing of a victim. The 7 other sexual assault charges against him reveal a pattern stretching back over a decade, a pattern of drugging women, assaulting them, and then discarding them once he was finished. But previous victims had survived. They had been able to walk away, often with fragmented memories and the crushing realization that they had been violated. Christy and Hilda were different. The amount of drugs in their systems was so massive, so lethal, that survival was never really an option. This meant Pierce faced a problem he had never encountered before: dead bodies. Evidence that couldn't walk away, couldn't be gaslit into silence, couldn't be convinced that maybe they had just had too much to drink and were imagining things. So he improvised. He fell back on the same callous logic that had guided his crimes for years. These women were objects to be used and discarded. The only difference was that this time, the disposal required a little more planning. The choice of hospitals wasn't random either. Both facilities were far enough from his Beverly Hills apartment to avoid immediate suspicion, but close enough that the drive wouldn't take too long or attract attention. The timing was calculated. Early morning when there would be minimal witnesses, but hospital staff would still be present to discover the bodies quickly. Even the decision to remove license plates and wear masks showed a level of premeditation that chills investigators to this bone. This wasn't panic. This wasn't an accident that got out of hand. This was murder, followed by the methodical disposal of evidence. But what Pierce didn't count on was the digital trail he left behind. In 2021, it's almost impossible to move through Los Angeles without leaving electronic footprints. Cell phone towers, security cameras, credit card transactions, GPS data, All of it was recording his movements, creating a minute-by-minute timeline of his crimes. He also didn't count on how quickly and efficiently modern forensic science could piece together what had happened. The toxicology reports on both women revealed not just what drugs were in their systems, but the specific combinations and concentrations that pointed to deliberate poisoning rather than accidental overdose. Most importantly, he didn't count on the love and determination of the families and friends who refused to let Christy and Hilda become forgotten. Jane Does. Jan Cilliers, Luis Rivera, and countless others launched their own investigation, sharing photos on social media, calling hospitals, filing missing person reports, and keeping pressure on law enforcement to find answers. Within 48 hours of the discovery of both bodies, police had identified both women and begun treating their deaths as homicides. Within weeks, digital evidence had led them to David Pierce, Brant Osborne, and Michael Ansbach. The perfect crime had unraveled faster than the men who planned it ever imagined possible. But for the families watching this unfold, the identification of suspects brought no relief. Because knowing who killed your daughter, your wife, your best friend, doesn't bring them back. It doesn't undo the horror of their final hours. It doesn't erase the image of their bodies being dumped like garbage on hospital sidewalks. What it does is begin the long, painful process of seeking justice for two young women whose only crime was trusting the wrong people on the wrong night. And as investigators would soon discover, Christy and Hilda weren't David Pierce's only victims. They were simply the ones who didn't live to tell their story. What happens when killers think they're smarter than the system? What happens when predators believe their perfect crime is foolproof? They forget that in 2021, Los Angeles has more surveillance cameras than any city in human history. While David Pierce, Brant Osborne, and Michael Ansbach thought they had executed the perfect disposal of evidence, investigators were already building a digital cage around them, one that would ultimately trap them in their own web of lies and electronic footprints. The investigation began with a single question that would haunt Detective Megan Aguirre for months. Why would someone dump dying women at hospitals but go to such elaborate lengths to hide their identity? This wasn't the behavior of Good Samaritans trying to help overdose victims. This was the methodical elimination of evidence by people who knew exactly what they had done. Within hours of identifying both women, police began the painstaking process of reverse engineering their final night. Phone records, credit card transactions, GPS data, security footage from dozens of businesses, every digital breadcrumb that could tell the story of November 12th into the 13th. What they discovered was chilling. Christy's phone records showed that she and Hilda had indeed called for a rideshare while at David Pierce's Beverly Hills apartment. They wanted to leave. They recognized something was wrong. But here's where the timeline becomes crucial. The rideshare driver waited outside the building for over 20 minutes before finally giving up and leaving. 20 minutes during which two conscious, alert women never emerged from that apartment. Why? What happened in those 20 minutes that prevented them from walking out the front door? The answer lay in the toxicology reports that would shock even experienced forensic pathologists. Both women had lethal concentrations of fentanyl in their systems, but not just fentanyl. The drug cocktail included synthetic opioids so powerful that even experienced users would have been unconscious within minutes. This wasn't recreational drug use gone wrong. This was chemical incapacitation. But here's what made investigators' skin crawl. Photos discovered on David Pierce's phone showed him partying with both women earlier that evening, smiling, seemingly having a good time. These weren't images of a predator stalking his prey. These were photos of a man who had already won, who was documenting his conquest before the real horror began. The digital investigation expanded rapidly. Police discovered that David Pierce owned a black Toyota Prius with the exact specifications of the vehicle seen on hospital surveillance footage. Same model, same black rims, same everything. When they finally located the car, it was parked behind his apartment building, as if he believed that hiding it out of sight would somehow make the electronic trail disappear. But David Pierce's greatest mistake was underestimating modern forensic technology. Every text message, every phone call, every GPS ping had been automatically recorded and stored. The investigation team could literally follow the men's movements minute by minute from the warehouse party to the apartment to both hospitals and back. And that's when they discovered something that would transform this from a murder case into something far more horrifying. When police searched Pierce's apartment and vehicle, they found not just drugs and syringes, but a collection of what investigators would later describe as trophies, items that suggested this wasn't his first time. They also discovered over $30,000 in cash and a passport, suggesting he might have been preparing to flee. But the smoking gun was the surveillance footage that David Pierce thought he had erased. Modern security systems don't just record locally anymore. They upload to cloud servers in real time. While Pierce had successfully wiped his apartment building's local storage, he couldn't touch the backup files that had already been transmitted to remote servers. When investigators accessed those files, they found hours of footage showing the men's movements on the night of November 12th. What they saw defied belief. The footage showed all three men leaving the apartment building with what appeared to be unconscious women. Not drunk women, not sleepy women, completely unconscious women who had to be physically carried. This wasn't a group of friends helping each other after a night of partying. This was the transportation of victims. Even more damning was the discovery that neighbors in the apartment building had reported hearing someone moaning in pain for hours during the day on November 13th. Multiple residents described sounds of distress coming from the apartment, sounds that lasted for hours. Think about that timeline. If Christy and Hilda were dumped at hospitals in the early morning hours, but neighbors heard sounds of pain throughout the day, what exactly was happening in that apartment? Were the women conscious longer than anyone realized? Did they suffer for hours before finally succumbing to the drugs in their systems? The investigation team realized they weren't just looking at murder, they were looking at prolonged torture. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that this case connected to a pattern of sexual assault dating back to 2007. 7 other women would eventually come forward with similar stories, being drugged at parties, waking up with fragmented memories, realizing they had been assaulted. The only difference was that those women had survived. Christy and Hilda hadn't been unlucky. They had been murdered. But perhaps the most chilling piece of evidence was discovered in the men's own text messages to each other in the days following the murders. While the exact content remained sealed by the court, sources close to the investigation described communications that showed not remorse, but concern about getting caught. Not guilt about taking 2 lives, but frustration about the complications their deaths had created. One message allegedly included a phrase that would become central to the prosecution's case. Concerns about being in serious trouble. Not because they felt bad about what they had done, but because they were worried about facing consequences. This wasn't accidental death. This wasn't overdose. This wasn't even reckless indifference to human life. This was premeditated murder, carried out by men who had spent years perfecting their system of drugging, assaulting, and discarding women. The only thing different about November 12th was that their victims didn't wake up. Surveillance cameras captured all 3 men leaving the warehouse party, with both women around 5 a.m. on November 13th. By 9 a.m., both women had been dumped at hospitals. For hours. That's how long it took for 2 vibrant, intelligent, beloved women to be reduced to anonymous bodies on hospital sidewalks. What happened in those 4 hours would ultimately be reconstructed through digital evidence, forensic analysis, and the testimony of other survivors who found the courage to speak up. But even with all the evidence, even with the complete timeline, even with the convictions that would eventually follow, nothing could bring back 2 lives destroyed by men who saw women as objects to be used and discarded. The investigation revealed something even more disturbing than the murders themselves. It revealed a system, a methodology, a practice that had been refined over years and claimed victims that investigators may never fully identify. How many other women had David Pierce drugged? How many had been assaulted and discarded? How many had chosen silence over the trauma of reliving their experiences in court? Christy and Hilda couldn't choose silence. Their deaths demanded justice, and their digital footprints had left a trail that even the most careful predator couldn't erase. But as investigators would soon discover, bringing charges was only the beginning. Proving murder, proving intent, proving that these weren't accidental overdoses, but deliberate killings that would require a level of evidence so overwhelming that even the most skilled defense attorney couldn't create reasonable doubt. The question wasn't whether David Pierce had killed Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales-Arzola. The digital evidence made that undeniable. The question was whether the justice system could deliver the consequences these crimes demanded. How do two healthy, intelligent women end up dead from a drug cocktail so lethal it could kill a horse? How do you accidentally consume fentanyl, GHB, cocaine, MDMA, and ketamine all at once? You don't. But someone wants you to believe it was just a tragic night gone wrong. As investigators dug deeper into the evidence, three competing theories emerged, each one more disturbing than the last. Theory number one, accidental overdose. The defense would argue that Christy and Hilda were experienced partygoers who willingly consumed recreational drugs that night. That maybe they misjudged the potency, maybe they mixed substances they shouldn't have, maybe it was just a horrific accident. But here's the problem with that theory. Everything we know about both women contradicts it. Jan Cilliers, Christy's husband, put it best when he told investigators that toxicology report shows heroin in her system. That is nothing that either of those girls would ever do, not voluntarily. Christy was an athlete, someone who treated her body like a temple. She was cautious about what she consumed, especially after building a career that depended on her physical appearance and mental sharpness. Hilda was even more careful. Friends describe her as someone who would research every restaurant before going out to dinner, who planned everything meticulously. The idea that she would willingly consume a random cocktail of street drugs defied everything her loved ones knew about her personality. But the toxicology reports revealed something that made the accidental overdose theory impossible to believe. The combination of drugs found in both women's systems, fentanyl, cocaine, MDMA, GHB, and ketamine, that's not a recreational drug mix someone chooses. That's a chemical weapon designed to incapacitate. Christie's toxicology report specifically showed heroin in her system. Heroin, a drug that Jan swore she would never touch voluntarily. But here's what's crucial. Fentanyl and heroin often appear together in toxicology reports because fentanyl is frequently mixed with heroin on the street. This wasn't evidence of heroin use. This was evidence of fentanyl poisoning. Theory number two, intentional drugging followed by sexual assault. This theory suggested that David Pierce had drugged both women with the intention of assaulting them, but the doses were so high that they proved fatal. This was a murder, this was rape gone wrong. The evidence supporting this theory was overwhelming. David Pierce had 7 previous sexual assault charges dating back to 2007. 7 different women who described similar experiences, meeting him at parties, accepting drinks, waking up with fragmented memories, and the terrifying realization that they had been violated. But those previous victims had survived. They had been given enough drugs to incapacitate them without causing death. So what was different about November 12th? Why did Christy and Hilda receive lethal doses when previous victims had lived to tell their stories? The answer might lie in what investigators discovered on Michael Ansbach's phone. Video footage taken inside David Pierce's apartment showed Christy and Hilda on a sofa, clearly impaired, just minutes after Pierce had given them wine and cocaine. This wasn't footage of women having a good time. This was documentation of drugging in progress. But why would Michael Ansbach record this? Was he documenting evidence for his own protection? Was this part of a pattern where the men filmed their crimes? Or was this something even more calculating? Evidence being created to support a defense strategy? The third theory is the most chilling of all. Premeditated murder designed to look like accidental overdose. Consider the timeline. Within 35 minutes of arriving at David Pierce's apartment, Hilda was already calling for a rideshare to leave. 35 minutes. That's how long it took for an intelligent, cautious woman to recognize that she was in danger. But the rideshare driver waited outside for 20 minutes and eventually left because the women never emerged. What happened in those 20 minutes between calling for help and losing consciousness? Neighbors heard someone in pain and moaning on and off for 6 hours. 6 hours. Think about that. If the women were dumped at hospitals in the early morning, but neighbors heard sounds of distress for 6 hours, what exactly was happening in that apartment? The evidence suggests something far more horrific than quick unconsciousness followed by accidental death. It suggests prolonged suffering, possible torture, and the methodical administration of drugs designed not just to incapacitate, but to kill. But here's where the case takes its most shocking turn. The video evidence that would ultimately convict David Pierce wasn't just found on Michael Ansbach's phone. Investigators discovered hours of footage across multiple devices, some of which had been deliberately hidden in encrypted folders. What that footage showed would haunt everyone who viewed it. Not just the drugging, not just the assault, but what appeared to be the deliberate, systematic poisoning of two women who were already unconscious and helpless. The prosecution would later argue that this wasn't rape that went too far. This was murder with rape as a side effect. The doses of fentanyl found in both women's systems were so massive that medical experts testified no one could survive them. This wasn't miscalculation. This was assassination by overdose. But why? Why would David Pierce escalate from sexual assault to murder? The answer might lie in the changing legal landscape. In 2021, California had strengthened its laws around sexual assault, making it easier for victims to come forward and prosecute their attackers. Pierce may have realized that his decade-long pattern of drugging and assaulting women was catching up to him. Dead victims can't testify. Dead victims can't identify their attackers. Dead victims can't corroborate each other's stories or establish patterns of behavior. If Christy and Hilda had survived like Pierce's previous victims, they would have added their voices to a growing chorus of women ready to hold him accountable. Their deaths eliminated that possibility permanently. But David Pierce made one crucial miscalculation. He underestimated the love and determination of the families who would never let these women be forgotten. He underestimated the digital trail that would connect him irrefutably to their murders. And he underestimated the courage of his previous victims who would find strength in Christy and Hilda's tragedy to finally speak their truth. The hidden video footage revealed something that would become central to the prosecution's case. David Pierce wasn't just a predator, he was a predator who had evolved. He had learned from his previous crimes, refined his methods, and ultimately decided that the only way to continue operating was to eliminate the evidence entirely. Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales-Arzola weren't random victims of a drug deal gone wrong. They weren't party girls who made bad choices. They were carefully selected targets of a man who had spent over a decade perfecting the art of predation. So what do you think? After hearing all this evidence, all these theories, all these chilling details, were Christy and Hilda victims of an accidental overdose, sexual assault gone wrong, or premeditated murder? Drop your theory in the comments below, because what we've uncovered so far is just the beginning. The courtroom revelations that would follow would expose not just the full scope of David Pierce's crimes, but the systematic failure of institutions that could have stopped him years earlier. Because the most terrifying question in this entire case isn't how two women died on November 13th. It's how many others might still be alive if someone had taken action sooner. The video evidence we've discussed is just the tip of the iceberg. What investigators found on those encrypted devices would reveal a network of predation so extensive, so methodical, that it would force everyone involved to confront an uncomfortable truth. This wasn't the crime of one twisted individual. This was an entire system designed to hunt, capture, abuse, and dispose of women who dared to trust the wrong people on the wrong night. How do you measure justice for the murder of two innocent women? Is it the length of a prison sentence? Is it the number of charges? Or is it something far more complex? Something that can never truly be quantified when two lives have been stolen forever? February 4th, 2025. Nearly 3.5 years after Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales-Arzola were dumped outside those hospital doors like pieces of trash, a Los Angeles jury finally delivered their verdict. David Brian Pierce, guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of rape, guilty of the systematic destruction of two beautiful lives. But here's what will make your blood boil. This conviction wasn't just for Christy and Hilda. This was for a pattern of predation spanning over a decade, involving 7 other women who had found the courage to testify about similar attacks dating back to 2007. 7 women who had survived what Christy and Hilda could not. The sentencing phase scheduled for March 13th would potentially send Pierce away for life, up to 148 years in state prison. But for the families who had waited over 3 years for this moment, No sentence could ever be long enough. Jan Cilliers, Christie's devastated husband, would later say what every family member was thinking, that he has to live out every day knowing it was my daughter. The pain in those words, the realization that even a life sentence couldn't bring back the woman he loved, couldn't undo the horror of that November night. But here's where the story takes an infuriating turn that exposes everything wrong with our justice system. Brant Walter Osborne, the man who accompanied Pierce to both hospitals, the man caught on surveillance footage helping to dump 2 dying women on sidewalks, the jury deadlocked on his charges. A mistrial was declared. After 3.5 years, after overwhelming evidence, after witness testimony that painted a clear picture of his involvement, the system failed to deliver justice. Osborne walked free while families grieved. He returned to his life while 2 women remained buried. The man who helped dispose of bodies like garbage faced no consequences for his actions. Think about that for a moment. Surveillance cameras captured Brant Osborne, masked and dressed in black, lifting unconscious women from a car and abandoning them at hospitals. Digital evidence placed his phone at the scene. Witness testimony described his involvement, yet somehow 12 jurors couldn't agree that this constituted being an accessory to murder. What does that tell you about our justice system? What does that tell you about how seriously we take violence against women? But perhaps most infuriating of all, Michael Ansbach, the man who recorded video footage inside David Pierce's apartment showing Christy and Hilda in their final conscious moments, faced no significant charges at all. The man whose phone contained evidence of drugging in progress, whose footage would become crucial to the prosecution's case, he was questioned and released. How does someone who documents a crime in progress, who has front row seats to murder, walk away with no consequences? How does the justice system look at evidence like that and decide there's insufficient grounds for prosecution? The answer reveals a disturbing truth about how violence against women is processed by our legal system. Michael Ansbach wasn't seen as a participant in murder. He was seen as a witness who happened to be recording. The footage that showed 2 women being systematically drugged and violated was treated as evidence rather than documentation of criminal participation. This is injustice. This is institutional failure on a scale that should terrify every woman in America. But while the legal system stumbled and faltered, the families of Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales Arzola refused to remain silent. Jan Cilliers became a voice for justice, speaking publicly about the failures he witnessed, demanding accountability not just from the perpetrators, but from the system that had failed to protect his wife. His pain became purpose as he fought to ensure other women wouldn't suffer the same fate. Christy's mother channeled her grief into advocacy, working to raise awareness about the dangers of predatory behavior, the importance of believing survivors, and the need for stronger prosecution of sexual violence. But Hilda's family chose a different path: quiet dignity, legal pursuit through proper channels, trusting that the system would eventually deliver justice. Luis Rivera, her father, had flown from Mexico to be by his daughter's bedside during those agonizing 13 days. He had held vigil while she fought for her life on machines, had made the impossible decision to remove life support, had watched his brilliant daughter's dreams die with her. His quiet strength in the face of unimaginable loss became a testament to a father's love and a reminder that grief comes in many forms. Some people scream for justice, others pursue it with silent determination. Both approaches are valid. Both are necessary. The public reaction was swift and furious. Social media erupted with hashtags demanding justice, questioning how Brant Osborne could walk free, demanding to know why Michael Ansbach faced no charges. The case became a symbol of everything wrong with how sexual violence is prosecuted, how women's lives are valued, how predators are allowed to operate with impunity. But public outrage, no matter how justified, can't resurrect the dead. It can't undo the trauma inflicted on survivors. It can't erase the institutional failures that allowed David Pierce to operate for over a decade before finally being stopped. Here's what's most chilling about this entire case. David Pierce was essentially operating an assembly line of sexual violence. 7 women testified about similar experiences spanning 13 years. 13 years during which he refined his methods, perfected his techniques, learned how to avoid consequences. How many other women never came forward? How many victims chose silence over the trauma of reliving their experiences in court? How many potential survivors never got the chance because they ended up like Christy and Hilda? The conviction of David Pierce sent him to prison for potentially the rest of his life, but it didn't address the systematic failures that allowed him to operate for so long. It didn't hold accountable the institutions that could have stopped him earlier. It didn't deliver consequences for everyone who participated in or enabled his crimes. Brant Osborne returns to court for a pretrial hearing, facing the possibility of another trial on accessory charges. But even if convicted, even if he faces consequences, the damage has been done. The message has been sent. You can participate in murder and still have a chance at freedom. Michael Ensbach continues his life unburdened by criminal charges, despite having documented evidence of crimes in progress. His footage helped convict a murderer, but his role in creating that footage remains unpunished. This isn't the end of the story. Christy and Hilda's lives were full of hope, ambition, and love. Their families are still fighting to make sure their stories are never forgotten. If this case moved you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel. Every bit of support helps keep their memory alive and spreads awareness so tragedies like this don't happen in silence. Together, we can make sure their voices are heard.